First of all, women die more often due to the consequences of climate change. UN showed that women are 14 times more affected in mortality than men due to climate change events, would it be floods or other types of extreme events, because there are lots of vulnerabilities. If we take the example of water, women are more responsible in collecting water. Women spend in average 16 million hours per day cumulated dedicated to collecting water in Africa, compared to only 4 million for men. They are more likely to be affected to drop schools, also in case of agricultural production. So in Africa, for example, they're responsible for more than 80% of the workforce, but they are less than 2% owners of the land. Women are also more affected. They are going to suffer greater loss. The consequences of climate change, for example, heat waves, have effects on the delivery health of women who are more affected. The slogan, I can breathe, about George Floyd. I think it's also something that we can take in terms of rural, urban, racial discrimination, racial, environmental injustice. And why this issue continues is also because those types of population are invisible in the public policies. And to come back on the definition of having inclusivity, how you create the law, how you create environmental justice in law, I just wanted to take the example of COP. Are they inclusive? And with COP26, is it the least inclusive COP? Because climate justice is also how you give political power within those COPs. As COP26 has hosted, I think it was 27,000 NGOs, and that more than 195 countries actually signed the agreement of COP26. There are lots of inequality in terms of space. So basically in COP you have the green zone, the blue zones. NGOs are only accredited within the green zone, and how you bargain to go to the blue zone where you actually can have political impact. So there are lots of barriers also how you pay to go to the COP, and I think in terms of funding this is really important. Finally, I wanted to emphasize on how education can provide actually political power. I think there are 4 points that can be emphasized on the power of climate education. Is how it reduces vulnerabilities, that is provide knowledge, but also political power, developing critical thinking, and finally engaging toward action. But one figure is that within the climate finance, only 0.03% of the climate finance is nowadays dedicated to climate education, which is not a lot to do with with everything that we have to do for every generation that is basically living the consequences of climate change, and especially in Africa. But pushing the effort of quality girls' education actually helps to reduce the vulnerabilities, but there are lots of barriers to that. And a recent report from UNESCO has highlighted how climate education is actually not in school yet. And there are lots of barriers about teachers not knowing how to teach about climate change with active pedagogies, with the necessary knowledge. So there is a great need for teachers to get the knowledge, because it's not only getting the right book, but it's also how you train teachers to actually integrate in their pedagogy in classrooms to be efficient and for the knowledge to be adaptive also. For example, if you talk about a case study on the mountains in France and how climate change affects mountains in France, it doesn't have any meaning for a student who lives in the other parts of the world. So this is also how we understand climate justice, about contextualizing to every context, to every situation, to every community. So the first point is also about critical thinking, because getting the knowledge is also to be able to reflect on what is climate change, what is the system of climate change which is happening, engaging students to report on climate, to report on environmental issues with those 4 steps, which is to first investigate, research solution, report, and disseminate, which is basically a common methodology to develop critical thinking. And the final point is actually to engage towards action, is to create actually adaptation projects within communities, to give sense and appropriation to what they're doing, to what the students can learn at school, in order to find their own solution. Because as we say, climate justice has different impacts. Locally, it's a global phenomenon, but with local impacts. And there are lots of projects happening, for example, in Mauritius, actually eco-school students going in the tourism field, working with entrepreneurs to actually see what are the solutions to adapt the tourism sector to the local consequences in terms of erosion. And with this final sentence, and maybe as we talk about environmental justice, is that maybe one objective that we can have is that no student should leave school without environmentally or climate educated.